Beneath the blazing sun of a fractured land, a single veil held the weight of an entire truth. The cowboy stood frozen, his hand trembling as whispers of warning echoed in his mind. What lay hidden was not just a secret. It was a wound carved deep into the soil of injustice, a scar no one dared to face. She pleaded for him to stop, to leave the cloth untouched, but his choice would expose more than her fears. It would unravel a darkness that had shaped generations. And once the veil was lifted, nothing could ever be the same again. The cowboy was no stranger to harsh frontiers. He had crossed deserts where the wind carried the cries of the forgotten, ridden through towns where silence spoke louder than justice, and seen men in power bury truths beneath layers of dust and denial. Yet nothing had unsettled him like the presence of that veil. It rested in the middle of a crumbling settlement, draped across a figure who bore the weight of history on her shoulders. The veil was more than cloth. It was a boundary between illusion and reality, between the stories the powerful told and the truth they desperately hid. Rumors whispered that beneath it lay a revelation that could shatter the myths holding the frontier together. Some said it was a reminder of stolen lands. Others believed it concealed the evidence of cruelty that could no longer be denied. The woman who wore it pleaded with him, her voice carrying the sorrow of generations silenced. To touch the veil was to invite consequences no one could escape. Still, the cowboy felt the weight of choice pressing against his chest. He had seen too many lies justified as law, too many injustices cloaked as order. Here, before him, was the chance to strip away the facade, yet fear gripped him, because once revealed, the truth could never be forgotten. It would demand accountability. It would demand change. And in a land built on shadows, such a demand was dangerous. The cowboy lingered before the veil, his shadow, stretching across the dust as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of fire and ash. His breath grew heavier with each passing second, and though the air was dry, his palms were damp with unease. He had fought battles, endured storms, and stood his ground against men who threatened his life. Yet now, in the silence of this moment, he felt smaller than ever, because the enemy here was not one he could fight with a gun. It was the truth. And truth was always the deadliest weapon of all. He recalled the voices of men in power, sheriffs, politicians, landowners, who had woven their authority like barbed wire across the land. They had crafted stories to protect themselves, tales that painted the oppressed as savages and the oppressors as saviors. Every town meeting, every courthouse ruling, every law etched into paper was built to preserve their version of justice. But he had seen cracks in their narrative. Villages burned without cause, families starved to feed the wealth of the few, lives discarded in the name of progress. And now, the veil seemed to hold the very proof of those lies. It was more than cloth. It was silence woven tight, secrecy stitched across generations. The woman's plea echoed again in his ears, trembling and desperate. She did not fear for herself alone. She feared for what the unveiling would unleash. The frontier thrived on illusions, and illusions were fragile things. If torn apart, they collapsed with fury. The cowboy's heart pounded as his mind battled itself. He thought of turning away, of walking back into the desert, letting the myths remain intact. After all, exposing the truth could make him a target, an outcast. Men who unearthed what was buried often met the same fate as those who had been buried. Yet something in his soul resisted retreat. He remembered the children he'd passed on the road, their faces hollow with hunger. He recalled the grave markers lined along riverbanks where entire families had vanished, their voices erased from the record books. He thought of the woman before him, her back bowed, her voice trembling, her existence a testament to survival, against forces that had tried to erase her kind altogether. The veil was not just a barrier, it was a test. To leave it untouched was to accept comfort over conscience, illusion over integrity. To lift it was to choose the harder path, the one drenched in consequence, but also in justice. The sun sank lower, casting the land into shadow. The cowboy stepped closer, his boots sinking into the dust with a heavy finality. His hand rose, trembling, as though every injustice of the frontier weighed upon his fingers. The veil fluttered slightly in the wind, as if it too knew the moment of reckoning had come. He hesitated, his heart torn between the safety of ignorance and the peril of truth. But deep within, he knew, history was not made by those who turned away. It was made by those who dared to see. At last, his hand touched the veil. The fabric was lighter than he imagined, soft against his calloused fingers, yet it seemed to burn as though carrying the fire of centuries. He closed his eyes, drew in a sharp breath, and pulled. The veil slipped away, and in that single movement, the myths of the frontier unraveled. What was revealed before him was not a hidden treasure, nor a simple truth. It was a wound, raw and undeniable. Beneath the cloth lay the remnants of lives erased, bones etched with suffering, artifacts of a people stripped of their dignity, and the silent testimony of brutality buried in plain sight. The cowboy staggered backward, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with disbelief. The stories he had been told, of savagery, of conquest, of righteous victory, collapsed into dust before him. What stood in their place was the evidence of cruelty carried out not by enemies from afar, but by those who claimed to bring law, order, and civilization. The heroes of history were revealed as executioners, and the victims, once silenced, now cried out from the earth itself. His knees buckled. He pressed his hands against the ground as if to steady a world that suddenly felt unrecognizable. Every bone, every relic beneath that veil was a voice, screaming against the lies he had believed, the laws he had followed, the banners he had saluted. The weight of it crushed him. Not just the sorrow of what had been done, but the shame of having been complicit even in silence. Tears blurred his vision as he realized there was no turning back. He could cover the truth again, pretend it had never been uncovered, but the revelation would haunt him. The veil had fallen, and with it, the illusion of innocence. He now carried the burden of knowing, and knowledge demanded a price, action, or surrender. The cowboy rose slowly, his body trembling beneath the weight of revelation. The veil lay crumpled in the dust, no longer a barrier, but a witness to what could no longer be hidden. Around him, the silence pressed heavier than gunfire, heavier than judgment. It was the silence of truth demanding to be heard. He understood now that the land he rode across was not simply scarred by time, but by design. Every law written, every monument raised, every tale of progress had been stitched together to cover the bones beneath. And though the cloth was gone, the structures of power that had created it still stood tall, feeding on ignorance and fear. The cowboy's gaze fell upon the horizon. He knew he could not ride away unchanged. To turn his back would mean joining the generations who had chosen comfort over conscience, silence over justice. But to carry this truth forward meant walking into conflict with the very foundations of the world he knew. His soul, however, could not bear the thought of returning to blindness. He mounted his horse, not with the swagger of a drifter, but with the solemnity of a man who carried a burden larger than himself. The veil was gone, but the choice was not his alone. It was for all who dared to look, all who dared to question, all who dared to speak the truths that power feared most. As he rode into the fading light, the question lingered, not only for him but for us. How long will we continue to live behind veils of illusion, pretending not to see the bones beneath our own history? And when the moment comes to lift the cloth and confront the truth, will we have the courage to face it, or will we let the veil fall back into place?